Compare and contrast. GLA-SW second grade virtual ELA lesson. Hello second grade, this is Mrs. Rideout coming to you with this week's ELA lesson. Before we get started, I wanted to just say your teachers and I are seeing all the great work being done and just wanted you to know how very proud we are of each and every one of you. Now this week, we will be learning a new skill, compare and contrast. So let's get started. This week's ELA objective is, I can compare and contrast two versions of the same story by different authors. So you may be asking yourself, what is the meaning of compare and contrast? Well, let's find out. Now let's take a look at this anchor chart. This anchor chart is showing you what compare and contrast means. We are going to break this anchor chart up into sections and we are going to discuss each one. So let's begin. Now let's look at this first part of our anchor chart. When you compare, you are telling how two or more things are similar. Similar means the same. And when you look at contrast, it tells how two or more things are different. So when you are doing compare and contrast, you are thinking about things that are similar, which means the same, or the differences, which means what's different. So let's look at the example on this part of our anchor chart. They use the example of cats and dogs. As you can see, they're comparing and seeing how they are the same, which is in the middle of this picture. And then on each side, they are writing how they are different. So for cats, cats are felines. They meow, they have whiskers, a scratchy tongue, and they're nocturnal. And for dogs, dogs are canines. They bark, they have a good sense of smell, and they walk on a leash. And then in the middle of this picture, it's showing you all the things that they have that are similar. They're both furry, they're both animals, they both walk on four legs, they have tails, and they are pets. Keywords to think about when you compare two or more things are, and let's go down the first column, in common, as well as similar and same. And in the second column, the words to, both, also, and alike. These are some keywords that you should be using and thinking about when you compare two or more things, especially when you're writing about them. Also, here are some keywords to think about when you contrast two or more things. Let's look at the first column and I'll read these words as well. They are different, while, although, though, and but. And in the second column, the words are however, unlike, even, instead. These are the words that you should be using and also thinking about when you contrast two or more things, especially when you're writing about them. Let's take a look at this graphic organizer. This graphic organizer is called a Venn diagram. We use this one when we compare and contrast to keep our thoughts organized. First, each circle represents the two topics you contrast, which remember means what is different about those two topics. The middle, where the circles meet, is where you compare the two topics or you write about what is the same about each of your topics. Let's do an example together. As you can see, we are going to compare and contrast apples and oranges. So we have our graphic organizer or our Venn diagram set up, and as you can see, in one circle we have the word apples, and in the other circle we have the word oranges, and in the center where the circles meet, we don't have anything written. Below our graphic organizer, we have a list of words that we are going to use to compare and contrast apples and oranges. I'm going to go over those words. I'll read the first row. Those words are fruit, red, and green. The second row, the words are smooth skin, food, and need warm weather. And in our last row, the words are orange, bumpy skin, and grows on trees. So let's take about 30 seconds to see whether or not you can figure out where each of these words would go on our graphic organizer. Now let's take a look at the completed Venn diagram. So we used the topics apples and oranges to compare and contrast. So if we look at the first circle of the Venn diagram, we would have the word apples, and underneath that we put the words red, green, smooth skin. And let's look at the second circle of the Venn diagram under the topic of oranges, and we use the words bumpy skin and orange. And now if we focus on the part of the Venn diagram where both of the circles meet, we wrote the words fruit, food, grows on trees, need warm weather. So we were able to compare, and that means find out what are the things that the two topics have in common. And we were also able to contrast, and that means look for the words that described or showed how the two topics are different. This week's read alouds are a little bit different. We are going to be listening to two different versions of the same story so that we can compare and contrast them. So the first story will be Little Red Riding Hood, and the second story will be Ninja Red Riding Hood. So these will be our two stories that we are listening to this week for our lesson. Let's wrap up today's lesson. Today, we focused on compare and contrast. We talked about what the definition of compare and contrast was. We focused on keywords that you should be using and thinking about when you compare and contrast, especially when you're writing about it. We learned about a brand new graphic organizer, the Venn diagram, and we also did an example together to show you how your information should be placed inside your Venn diagram. And we also talked about the differences this week with your read alouds. Now, just a few quick reminders about what good readers do. Remember, good readers visualize. Good readers form those I wonder questions, and they are always thinking about what they are reading. Before we end our lesson for today, I want to revisit our lesson from last week. Last week we focused on story structure. Remember, that was focusing on the characters, the setting, the problem, the key details that support the problem, and the solution in the story. This week, I want you to keep that in mind when you are listening to the two different versions of our stories. Remember, when you compare and contrast, you are thinking about what is the same and you are thinking about what is different. So when you're listening to these two stories, I want you to think about, how are the characters the same? How are they different? How is the setting the same? How is it different? How is the problem the same? How is it different? And how are those key details the same and different? And lastly, I want you to think about the solution in the story and how they are the same and how they are different. I hope you enjoy the versions of the two stories that you're going to listen to, and that you have fun completing our ELA lessons for this week. Until next week's lesson, goodbye.